Well, good morning. I'm here at a baseball field in Brigham City, and it's oddly empty right now, but that might be because it's sort of early in the morning, and because we're on a shelter-in-place protocol right now. But I'm here today because of an issue that Jesus raised the last time we saw him in the Sermon on the Mount about being salt and light. And the issue he raised, well, he's going to explain now, it's what he's going to do, is our failure to be salt and light has something to do with, I don't know, a problem with our performance. So we're going to look at that today. All I could think about was baseball when you think about performance. You know, where I grew up, it turned out that on our street outside of Washington, D.C., in suburban Maryland, were all these people who lived in suburban Maryland, in this bedroom community, and who went down to Washington, D.C. to work, which means we had a lot of federal workers in our neighborhood. And they were all kind of impressive in their way. Our next door neighbor worked for the Food and Drug Administration. In fact, one year, after he was tasked with doing an audit of hot dogs with a microscope, he said, you know, you're going to want to lay off of hot dogs. Didn't slow me down. I still love him to this day. Had another fellow just a couple doors down from that who worked for the Naval Weapons Lab. He was a chemist, and he worked on special coatings for submarines. Down the street from him was a veterinarian, a private practice veterinarian, but he also worked a lot of hours under contract for the National Zoo. So he had some exotic animals in his house. I remember one time going into his house, and his poodle was laying on the ground. A nice, really smart poodle, but above the poodle, on the wall, was a 3-foot iguana. That's just too cool. But none of them had any kind of sway in my young mind in terms of wow factor as the guy who lived down at the end of Woodman Avenue. All these people lived on Woodman Avenue like us, but this guy at the end of Woodman Avenue was a real, live, professional baseball player. He worked for the Washington Senators, not a very prestigious team, I admit. They didn't have much going for them. But what they did have going for them was the fact that they had this one guy for a short amount of time who was absolutely a powerhouse home run hitter. And his name is Frank Howard. Now, Frank Howard actually lived on our street, and he had kids about the same age as us. And so we sort of got along with him, but they were somewhat spoiled. Frank Howard is really interesting. If you don't know his name, everyone knows about Babe Ruth, who was the big home run king. But Frank Howard in the 60s was a killer. I remember seeing him when I was a kid. He big guy. I think he's over 6'5", maybe 6'6". He was originally recruited out of college to go into basketball, but he made it into the leagues, in the baseball leagues. And what he could do really well was swing a bat and do home runs. Partially because at 6'6", I'm guessing, maybe 7. The arc of his swing was huge. I mean, you could sweep up the world with the arc of that swing. And on top of that, he had the weight. The guy was big. He wasn't overweight, but he just had a lot of oomph behind him. So when he swung a bat and he made a connection to the ball, it went places. In 1968, I remember he did one really phenomenal thing as a kid. I remember this. 68 was a horrible year. 68 started out in January with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, and because of the Tet Offensive, everyone was convinced that we were losing the Vietnam War, as opposed to what all the newscasters had been saying at the time. The Tet Offensive in January. Then you get to April, and in April you have the tragic and shocking assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. When you get to June, you have again another shocking assassination of John F. Kennedy's little brother, Bobby Kennedy, while he was campaigning. And in between those 2 months, there was a bright piece of good news, and that was Frank Howard in his home run streak. And it turned out he set a record during 1 week in May. 1 week in May, in 20 at-bats in 1 week, he hit 10 home runs. I don't think anyone has ever paralleled that. 20 at-bats, 10 home runs. So as kids, we were just thrilled about the fact that this guy actually lived on our street. He lived on our street. It caused a lot of enthusiasm about baseball, and as a result, we talked my dad into taking us down to a professional game in Washington, D.C., so we could see Frank Howard hit his home runs. I never saw him hit his home runs, But we did go to a baseball stadium for the first time in my life, a professional one. And when I got to the stadium and I looked at the field, kind of like how I'm looking at this field right now, I looked at that field and I looked at how far away the home run fence was, which is in most stadiums somewhere between 300 and 400 feet. And I looked at the dimensions of that stadium and I thought, this is impossible. There is no way you're going to be able to hit a ball from home plate all the way over that outfield fence. This is impossible. And not only that, the distance from the pitcher's mound right there, the pitcher's mound to the plate is 60 feet. In those 60 feet, that ball's traveling at you at warp speed, and somehow you have to swing the bat with all your weight behind it, square enough on a little round face that it's going to launch into the air at about 40 degrees in the air, and it's going to go over 400 feet. That's impossible. Now, as a kid, I tried to play baseball in my enthusiasm because Frank Howard lived on our street and you have to love baseball. I tried, but I was really bad at it. The batting and even the throwing, but the batting was impossible. When I saw the stadium, I realized I'm never going to be a professional player. But even on the smaller fields like this one, is impossible. And I realized after the fact that what the problem with my performance was, I was nearsighted, and no one knew it yet. I was nearsighted. So as I stood on the home plate and I watched the pitcher pitch that ball, all my poor vision eyes could see was the fuzzy, slight smudge of a body twisting around and spinning its arms, and then nothing, shoom, and the ball would go by. I mean, there's just no way in baseball that you can actually hit the ball unless you can see it coming, unless you can plan for it coming. You have to see its entire trajectory to be able to do this well. So I just couldn't do it. I don't think I ever really hit a baseball in any of the play we had with the kids that we were with, and I'm pretty sure I never made it on base with one. But Frank Howard could get up to the plate, he could see the ball coming, he could swing accurately enough, and he could send it 400 feet away, or 300 feet, I forget what the stadium was at the time, but that ball field, he could send it away and get a home run. 10 times in 20 times at bat. That's just remarkable. In fact, just to give you some perspective, if you're not a baseball stats person, and believe me, if you want a game that has stats, then what you want is baseball. Of course, all the sports things do that, but baseball has just a page of stats. If in terms of home runs, how many home runs does it take for you in a season to qualify as like a real player? Well, the top 5 players today, the top 5 players in baseball, who are considered top 5 because of their home runs, usually hit on the order of 40 home runs a year, 40 home runs a season. So what we're saying is basically Frank Howard, in 20 at-bats, in 1 week, 20 at-bats, he came up with 10 home runs. He came up with a quarter of the season's home runs he needed to be ranked in the top 5 of all home run hitters. It's astonishing. Well, in later years, Frank Howard had some problems with performance, as that's what we're talking about today, and didn't do quite as well as those years in the late 60s. And then the Senators ended up doing so poorly, they ended up being turning into the Texas Rangers, and so the Senators were no more. But the issue is performance is everything in a sports team like this. It's everything. And with me, I realized that I can't play baseball because I can't see. It's a performance issue. There's something I'm blind about that I can't get past, and getting past that was impossible for me until I got glasses, which is well past the time I was playing baseball. But the problem with performance is it's easy to see how you're coming up short. It's not always easy to see why you're coming up short, and I couldn't see why I was coming up short. Jesus says in the end of the last section we looked at that we need to be salt and light, but there's a problem that we have. That is, our saltiness goes away. How is that possible? Well, from a physics perspective, the element, sodium chloride, can't really lose its saltiness. So Jesus is using something of an impossible example, but he's making a really solid point, which is, if salt loses its saltiness, then what do you use it for? It's got no purpose if it loses what its essential nature, what its essential purpose is. And then he makes another point about light. If you're not a light in the place where people need light, then what's the purpose of it? I mean, you don't put yourself under a basket. You put yourself on a lampstand. So he's really talking about performance problems, just like with Frank Howard and me on the baseball diamonds. There are performance problems. So now Jesus is going to move on in the Sermon on the Mount and talk about what we're blind to about our performance problems that makes us not salt and not light. So let's sit down and talk about this a little bit, because the next few words he speaks are staggering. Only 4 verses this morning, and we're going to see what they all talk about. And it's going to take us a little while to chew on it. So I'm going to find somewhere to sit here. I think I'll go to the dugout over here. Let's go over to the dugout, and we'll have a sit down and just have a chat together. So hold on, I'll be back in a second. Oh, okay, this looks pretty good. Let's just have a sit down right here, and we'll talk about this for a little bit. Whoa! So we have a performance problem, and the issue is to try and figure out what's going on. So let me just go right into the passage right now, and I'm going to read it to you, and let's just see what Jesus says as he talks about what our problem with our performance is. And just before we get there, for people who were struggling at the time with performance issues and accusations from what I call the religious scolds at the time, the Pharisees, there was a great frustration with the fact that there were a lot of rules in Judaism that you had to follow. There's a lot of rules in baseball as well, but if the rules are so many that you don't know what to do, an obvious solution would be to reduce the number of rules, right? That would seem to be the way to go. So Jesus comes right out of the batter's box, into the batter's box, out of the batter's box. He comes right up to the plate and swings a big one. This is what he says. He says, we're in Matthew 5, just to remind you where you are, verse 17. He says, Jesus speaking, "Don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I haven't come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Well, that's extraordinarily curious all by itself. And we'll come back to that. We'll spend some time on that. But then he goes on. He says, "For truly I say to you," verse 18, "until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." So if you're hoping that we're going to somehow do away with pieces of the law, forget. That's not going to happen. And it gets stronger. Verse 19, "Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." No relaxing the law, no reducing the numbers of them. The law is the law, and it's a good thing, and don't mess with it, he says. And then the final verse he gets to in verse 20, and this is staggering. "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Never. Exceed? Well, that's like impossible. Because at the time, the scribes and the Pharisees, they were the professionals when it came to the law. They're the ones who understood what the law was all about. They're the ones who spent their entire lives dedicated to understanding what the law said. So how do you do this? Jesus says, "I came to fulfill the law." Whatever that means, and we'll talk about that. And if you mess with the law, you reduce it. That's a bad deal. But then you're still going to be judged on whether or not you do the law. And you have to do it better than the Pharisees. Let me describe to you a little bit about the context of that, because the scribes and the Pharisees, not well known to us today, but they were very well known at the time. That's why I like to call them religious scolds, because that's what they were. They were religious scolds. They would come on you and tell you when you're doing right and when you're doing wrong. According to whom? According to us who have studied the books. Now, in Jewish law, when you say the word law, it's sort of unfortunate, because when we think law, we think, going the speed limit. But the law there was really a construct in the nation of how you conduct yourself as a citizen of the nation, and it's prescribed by God. That's basically it. From God's perspective, it was always meant to be a statement of what God's characteristics, his character and his righteousness look like in the flesh. But the Jews, the religious leaders, had done some bizarrely bad things over the years. And they had created 2 strains of truth when it came to the law. And this exists to this very day, in fact. You've got the law that comes out of the Bible, for one, and then you've got the law that comes out of the mouths of rabbis, number 2. Are they connected? Sorta, but not always. So for instance, if you were referring to the law that came out of the Bible, you would first ask a Jew, what's the law as mentioned in the Bible? And they would say, well, the 10 Commandments, that's a good start. Yeah, that's a very good start. and then on to whatever is in the rest of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the first 5 books, the Torah, the Pentateuch we call it. And then you go on to the prophets like Jeremiah and Isaiah and stuff like that. And they would say, yeah, that's all truth. That's all the law. That's all good stuff. That's what's there that God put there. So they would always say, this is the law of Moses. That's the first 5 books, Moses and the prophets. So when you heard Jesus talking about Moses and the prophets, he's talking about what's in the Bible in its entirety. That's the shorthand way of saying that. Today, there's a sect of Judaism that only takes its truth from the Bible. They're the closest equivalent to what we are in terms of biblical evangelicals. I mean, we will say, it's interesting what people say, what learned men say about truth. But hey, tell me what's in the Bible and I'll go with that. Well, there is a group of Jews today that say just that, and that's the Karaites. And the Karaites are the ones that go around and saying, if it's in the Bible, I believe it. But then there's the other half of the strain of the law, which is an oral pass down from rabbi to rabbi from ancient times, evidently. And for some Jews, the legend goes like this, which is God gave the law to Moses, but he also spoke some other things sort of under the table, orally, and it never got written down. And so the rabbis, the followers of God from that point, passed it on orally, mouth to mouth, ear to ear, for generation after generation, and that's the oral law, they would call it. And today that's characterized by the term it's called rabbinic Judaism, which means truth can come as equally from the rabbis as it can come from the written word. And so the law is segmented into these 2 halves, what comes out of the Bible and what comes by direct revelation or by logical interpretation by the rabbis. Well, this scribes group that we've talked about a lot are the guys who basically passed down that oral law, and then eventually they wrote it down. So somewhere around the 3rd century, they decided, we've got to stop just passing this down orally. We need to write this down. So they wrote into a thing called the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is, finally on paper, it's like a competitive volume against the Bible in terms of what the rabbis themselves said the law was all about. The best thinking of the rabbis say, and that was put down in the Mishnah in the 3rd century. If you were to translate it into English, this Mishnah that they wrote down in the 3rd century, it would come down to about 800 pages in English. It's big, it's involved, it's in depth. And they would not only interpret what's in the Bible, but even add some of their own spin to what they interpret in the Bible. Later on, those the generations of rabbis would read the Mishnah, the passed down oral Torah in that sense. They would read the Mishnah and they'd make commentaries on that, and they'd say, what we're talking about is very valuable. We should write down our commentaries on the Mishnah, which is the written oral code. We need to write down our commentaries. And so they started doing that, and that's called the Talmud. And the guys who would do all this thinking and logical extension of what was in the Mishnah and of the oral law, they were called the Talmudim. That's the plural. So the Talmud is this commentary on what that's all about, and the Talmudim are the guys who wrote it. Well, it got even bigger after that. I said the Mishnah was 800 pages in English. Well, when you get to the Talmud, there's 2 basic strains of the Talmud. One's called the Jerusalem Talmud and one the Babylonian Talmud, from 2 kind of geographical traditions of it. But if you take the Jerusalem Talmud today, it's huge. It's 12 volumes. The Mishnah was 800 pages, and now you have the commentary on the Mishnah, which itself is 12 volumes. If you go to the Babylonian Talmud, the commentary on the Mishnah, the Babylonian Talmud is 60 volumes. So here's the frustration when you come to Judaism, is you not only have to be an expert in the Bible if you want to follow the law adequately, if you don't want to have performance problems, and that's enough all by itself. But then you have to be an expert on the oral law, or the Mishnah, which is written down, and you have to be an expert on the commentaries on the Mishnah, the Talmud, both the Jerusalem and the Babylonian versions of it, and then somehow do all those things as well. So it was a full-time job for the Pharisees and the scribes to maintain this database and to make sure that they scolded the population into doing what God wanted, where in fact many times it wasn't what God wanted, it was what the rabbis wanted. And this was the problem in Jesus' day. The law had been contaminated by well-intentioned and zealous rabbis who extended the law into areas of silliness. Silliness. I mean, a really good example shows up when you talk about washing or not washing. Because in Mark 7, the Pharisees are doing their religious scolding, and they come upon Jesus' disciples, and they're eating without washing their hands. Of course, we run over this entire passage because we always wash our hands, especially now. Wash your hands, wash your hands. So it doesn't seem like it's a bad thing. But the whole washing of hands was, while we agree with it hygienically and we're not repulsed by it, was a total creation of the Pharisees. And so they get bent out of shape in Mark 7. And you see there that Mark, when he writes his book on this whole scene, puts in parenthetical thought. He says that these people were holding to the tradition of the elders, not the law in that sense. And it goes on later in Mark 7. He says, and there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. So here you have the law scolds telling what they can and cannot do. There was already a separation in the law between what the rabbis wanted people to do, which was not godly necessarily, but it was unnecessary. And in fact, Jesus he ends up scolding the Pharisees when you get to Matthew 23, the famous woes to the Pharisees. And he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you tithe mint and dill and cumin. I mean, the very smallest things. You're doing a great job on the tiny things. And by the way, before you put that down, we don't have a really good intuitive understanding of spices. During the time, spices were very, very expensive. It was one of the few things that were imported into an area. Many of them came out of India, such as cumin. So, it was expensive. It was like money in a sense. So tithing that is not that unusual in that sense, but it does emphasize the point that you're tithing with something that is infinitesimal and detailed. And so that's a really good commentary on where they were going with the law. They decided that if the Ten Commandments were good, then more is better, and we'll tell you what the Ten Commandments mean and what the rabbis are thinking about and walking around all day and trying to figure out what's right and wrong. How do we properly perform the law? We don't want to have problems with the law. This is what you need to do so you don't have problems with the law. Now, this exists famously to this very day in Orthodox Jewish communities, things they will and will not do on the Sabbath, and they're legendary. If you go to Israel and you're in a hotel that has an elevator, you'll find on the Sabbath that the elevator will be running in Sabbath mode. Sabbath mode is an elevator that you can use on the Sabbath without you needing to push a button, because pushing a button is work. How does a Sabbath mode elevator work? Does it read your mind to figure out what floor you want to go to? No, it's much easier than that. They just set the elevator so that all day long on the Sabbath, for 24 hours, from sundown to sundown, that elevator goes up and down the hotel, opening at every floor over and over. Floor 1, open, close. Floor 2, open, close. Floor 3, open, close. And does this up and down all day long. Tremendous waste of energy. But you can walk onto the elevator and walk off the elevator, and as long as you're not walking very far, you're not violating the Sabbath, and you're not pushing a button, and that's very important. And God is very pleased with you because you're not pushing buttons. Now, I say that with a little sarcasm in my voice because that's where rabbinic Judaism had gone. It had started to devolve to such an extent that the law had turned into the minutia of silliness. Today, there's a great market for a whole bunch of Sabbath products in Israel, and that are used in Jewish communities around the world. One of my favorites is the Sabbath light switch. Now, it's illegal, not illegal. Well, yeah, it's illegal. It's against the law. It's against the Jewish law to turn on a light switch during the Sabbath. You know why? Because pushing a button is work. Well, sort of, but only because when you push a button, inside the mechanism of the button there's electricity flowing, and when electricity stops and starts, when you open or close two pieces of metal touching each other, it causes a momentary spark. And it does. I know electricity, it does this. Well, you know what that little spark is? Fire. It's fire. And it is not lawful to make a fire on the Sabbath, so you can't push a button. So a lot of these light switches that are used, do sense other things about you that are not unlawful to do. For instance, breathing. So that's one of my favorite devices, is the breath switch. So if you happen to get up close enough to the switch and you don't blow on it, because blowing that would be against the law. But if you get close to it, that you just breathe on it, because it can't be against the law to breathe. You need that for life. Just come up to it and you breathe on it. It turns the light on. That's cool. Almost every stove, electric stove, gas stove, has a Sabbath mode built into it as well. You look into this. So this is where the law had gone. But that part of the law is not God's law as in the Bible. That's rabbinic interpretation of the law. And in that, they're scolding you to tell you that if you do these things the way we say you should do them, then indeed God will be satisfied with you because you'll be doing the law. Well, that's wrong. And Jesus never supported that kind of stuff. Paul never supported that kind of stuff. So why is it that Jesus says that what you need to do in terms of the law, why does he tell us that there's silly things in the law? Instead, he says in verse 20, I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. Unless you exceed that. Well, they're doing too much to start with. So that's a curiosity. We'll need to come back to that because that's a very odd comparison. But before we leave that, I want you to pick up the fact that what the two different hearers in the group would react to that. For the people who heard that, they would think, well, heck, if the Pharisees can't get it done, how can I get it done? I mean, they're professionals in what's in the law. They study it all day long. How am I supposed to have a chance at this? This is the same reaction I had when I went out to that baseball field, professional baseball field for the first time. I saw how far away the fence was. I saw the pitcher's mound and the batter's box. I thought, this is impossible. No one can do this. Exactly. But then the ears of the Pharisees, what did they hear when they heard that? Your righteousness has to exceed that of the Pharisees. What did they hear? They heard they're not getting there either. They're not doing enough. Everybody's failing. Everybody has a performance problem when it comes to the law. That's what Jesus is saying. And if your hope isn't somehow changing the law, don't think about it. Don't think about it, because that's not going to happen either. Well, then if you switch gears for a second and talk about Jesus as an example, you read the New Testament, Jesus, well, I got a couple of birds over here that are just having a wonderful time. Oops, there they go, scared them away. Was Jesus a great example of the law? Well, when you read the New Testament, he was getting in trouble about interpretations of the law all the time. The scolds are coming to him all the time. But not on small stuff like washing hands. Big stuff like violating the Sabbath. That's the big one. That is the big one, violating the Sabbath. So I was curious and I went and I looked to find out how many times Jesus is accused of violating the Sabbath. I came up with at least half a dozen. It goes on. Here's a list. Look at this list of Jesus violating the Sabbath. Mr. Law himself. Matthew 12:1, he's plucking heads of grain with his apostles. Remember that? They're feeding themselves and they get jumped on for that. And in Mark 3 and in Luke 6, he heals the man with the withered hand. That's a great standoff, by the way, because there's a great cinematic buildup to healing this man where the guy's hand is there being offered to be healed. And the Pharisees are looking at him going, you don't want to do this. And Jesus challenges them. It's a great scene. Go read it for yourself in Mark 3, Luke 6. Another place, there's this woman who's bent over who can't straighten up, and Jesus heals her in Luke 13 on the Sabbath, gets scolded because of that. Next chapter, Luke 14, there's a man with dropsy, and this man is healed on the Sabbath, gets in trouble for that. When you switch over to John 5, remember the paralytic guy who's at the pool of Bethesda? That was on the Sabbath. It almost looks as though Jesus is choosing the Sabbath to do these sometimes. And then very famously in John 9, you have the blind man who's healed. And that causes a whole bunch of problems with the Pharisees, not only just because it's the Sabbath, but because it's impossible to heal a blind man. Yeah, it is. So in all those cases, he gets accused of violating the Sabbath. It seems as though when you take a cursory reading of the Gospels, that Jesus is not a paragon of the law. He seems to be sort of flouting it in many cases. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to us what's going on. Well, as we try and unravel what's going on here, a lot of Christians who are not really well trained in what the law is and what it means will often quote somewhat ignorantly, they'll pull out of context from Romans 10, where Paul himself, remember, the ex-Pharisee, the guy who came to Jesus, so he ought to really know what the law is all about. And Romans is about the law. I mean, if you want to gain more understanding, that's a great place to go and look. But in Romans 10:4, they'll quote and pull out of context. Well, Christ is the end of the law for righteousness. Christ is the end of the law. Law's done with. We're out of here. We're done. But in doing that, you violate the very thing Jesus was saying. You can't remove any of the law. But Christians in a wrong way end up thinking that the conflict between grace and law makes the law obsolete in that way. But the law is not obsolete. The law is a statement of what the godliness of God, the character of God looks like in human flesh. It's not obsolete at all. But the problem is we have a problem with performance. And that's what we want to get back to again. I can't hit a baseball to 400 feet, and neither can you or I satisfy the dictates of the law, the dictates of what godliness looks like in the flesh. And that's the point. And you can apply yourself like the Pharisees, trying to derive what that means in the smallest minutia, but you'll still be failing to do that. Remember that section I talked about in Matthew 23 about the tithing, the spices and stuff like that? Let me read the rest of the passage to you, because it's intriguing. Matthew 23:23, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin." Okay, now we start to get to the problem. "But you've neglected the weightier matters of the law." Like what? Justice, mercy, faithfulness, the big things. So here they're majoring in the minors and not doing a bad job being exhaustive in that sense, but they're missing the heart of the law, like justice and like mercy and like faithfulness. Justice, doing right by your fellow man. Mercy, being compassionate, putting yourself in his shoes. Faithfulness, following through with your promises to other people. And then he really lays it on them in the next verse. He says, you're so good at dealing with the minutia. Think about sipping your cup of tea for a second. You're out camping and the gnats keep getting in your tea and you have to keep scooping them out and straining them out of your tea, and it's hard work if you got a lot of bugs where you're camping. Well, that's what it's like there. Think about sipping a cup of tea and working so hard to keep from swallowing all the gnats. He says, what you guys do in this minutia of the law that you have created and that you support is you're straining at gnats and you're swallowing camels. The very thing you're trying to achieve, the thing you're trying to avoid, you're failing massively failing at it. Why? Because the heart of the law is bigger issues than just turning on a light switch. It's about issues like justice and mercy and faithfulness and much, much more. And now we're getting at the core of the problem of performance when it comes to the law. Paul, when he talked about his fellow Jews, and he's really highlighting the Pharisees and the scribes at this, the guys who they were the law scolds of the people. With a fair amount of compassion in his heart, he writes in Romans 10, verses 1 through 4, and I'll just take a piece out of it. He says, they have a zeal for God. They're honest in what they're doing. They have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. They were ignorant about what the righteousness of God looks like. They thought it was tithing mint, dill, and cumin. But it's really about much bigger issues, much deeper heart issues. And now we start to understand where the performance problems are. They aren't on the exhaustive demonstration of what you do with the law on the outside of your life. It's about the nature of your heart. That's the problem of performance when we talk about the law and stuff like that. And so here he says, because you misunderstood what righteousness means, you've created your own sense of righteousness. And then you go around town scolding villagers because they're not doing your idea of what righteousness is all about. Ring any bells for you? This is not just the Jews. This happens in every false religion. But he says Christ is the telos. He's the telos of the law. Telos means the end. And it's a hard word to translate. It's a wonderful word to translate. End is not a great translation of it, although it sort of is. Telos always talks about the end of a process or actually the point of a thing. If someone starts going on a story with you, and you say, "What? Just get to your point. What's your point of all this? You're working towards something. I don't know what you're working towards." Telos is kind of like the point of everything. It's the final conclusion. It's the central purpose and the point that this all points to. And so when Paul talks about the fact that Christ is involved in the law, he says that Christ is the point of the law. It's the final ending point. It's the purpose of the law for righteousness for everyone who believes. So if you're intent on righteousness, that is, performing, performing under the law, then what you need to do is you need to find that fulfillment in Christ, he's saying. Christ is the telos of the law. And in other places, he tells us that the law itself is like a tutor to us. It tutors us, and it kind of leads us by the hand to Christ, where we can finally find righteousness in our lives rather than trying to create our own righteousness. There's another time when a guy came to Jesus. This gives us insight into the law once again. And when he comes to Jesus, he asks him, this is in Matthew 22, around verse 35, he says, one of them, a lawyer, which means this is a guy who's well versed in the written law, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. Well, now Jesus is getting at something here. He didn't come right out in that first part in the Sermon on the Mount and tell us there's too many laws. But here he's telling us quite quickly that the law can be reduced to two things. And the central heart word of the law is love. Love for God and love for men. That is love for God and love for the people that God loves, mankind. The law can be reduced to that. And he says, in effect, if you're disparaged, if you're desperate in dismay about how to satisfy the minutia of the law as per the law scolds the Pharisees, don't get all messed up about that. The issue is love. And love is the basis of he says, on these two commandments, the whole law and the prophets depend upon it. That's the center of it. And so that's really your watchword. That's how you can tell what's going on. Let me take a break for a second and we'll kind of finish this. There are other places that aren't even in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, about the fact that the nature of the law is really about the nature of your heart. And the nature of your heart comes down to a very easily understood concept, and that concept is love. We all know what love is. We have relationships that inform us about what love is. So it's not hard to put two and two together here when you finally realize that. Now listen, here's another interesting one. Near the end of the Old Testament, in Micah 6:8, he says this. He says, he's told you, O man, what's good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. There, it's reduced down to something very simple. But look at that closely for a second. Justice is how you deal with other people, especially when they visit injustices upon you. What do you say back to them? To do justice, to love kindness, and this is our friend word, chesed, in the Old Testament. It's really this loyal, devoted love. It's a love that's not too unlike what agape is in the New Testament. It's dedicated to the well-being of another person. It's a very loyal kind of devotion in that sense, a kindness and a mercy. It's translated lots of different ways. But literally he says, you need to do justice and to love love. And to love love. And most importantly, and listen to the relationship factor in Micah 6:8. And lastly, and to walk humbly with your God. Could it be, in fact, that the point of the law is to bring us into the nearness of God, and to walk humbly with that God? Could it be that the law is that? In fact, and it is. Again, Paul reinforces for us the fact that the law is our tutor. It's trying to take us someplace. It's not the end in of itself, but is extraordinarily important according to Jesus. So don't think you can get by just erasing it somehow or changing the content of it. It has a purpose to it. And that purpose is to highlight for us what the character of God is like. And it's easiest to understand when we see it incarnated in people around us and in us. To love justice, to love mercy and devoted love toward other people and loyalty, and faithfulness to others, the promises for you as you extend yourself to other people. This is what the characteristics of God are like. This is what God says you need to be like as well. If you want to be one of my children, this has got to be part of your heart as well. But notice, these are indeed heart issues. And that's what's important about these things. The law isn't just the externals of what you do, although that follows naturally. The issue of the law is the heart. And this is how the Pharisees were having performance problems with the law. They thought it was just what you did on the outside, and it didn't matter what was on the inside of their heart. That's why Jesus took them to task. We read this last week about cleaning the outside of their cups, what people can see, and not dealing with cleaning the inside. Do you realize the inside of your cup is filthy? And in this way, Jesus is fulfilling the law. Because Jesus not only did the outside perfectly, but his heart itself was the heart of God. Loving kindness, justice, mercy, compassion toward other people. A passage that we've read a lot because I just love it. It says exactly the right thing. Again, in the Old Testament, Jeremiah looks forward to the future and looks at how things will change in regards to our relationship with God and our relationship with the law. And he says in Jeremiah 31, part of verse 33, he says, I'll put my law within them. I will put my law within them. I will put my law within them. As opposed to writing it on stone tablets, I'll put my law within them and I'll write it on their hearts. The law is meant to reside in our hearts. I'll put my law within them and I'll write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Again, the final emphasis on it is relationship with God. And I will be their God, and they will be my people. This is the point of the law, to bring us into relationship with God because we fall in love with the characteristics of his heart. And eventually, by God's doing, he himself will take that law, those characteristics of God that reflect his nature in the flesh, and he will not apply it to the outsides of our life. He'll apply it to the insides of our life. And that's God's job. That's what he does. And this is how Jesus is trying to tell these folks they've got performance problems when it comes to the law, because they're ignoring the nature of their heart. They're ignoring the nature of their heart. One last passage, then we'll quit right here. They're standing on the baseball field. As we're standing on what has been my entire life, my performance problem domain in the baseball field. Listen to what he says right here when we look at Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. Now, these are all Old Testament. These are all Old Testament. Jesus has a good cause to take the Pharisees to task, because they should have read this stuff. They should see this. Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart. That's dealing with the ugly parts of your heart. He'll circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. God will deal with the performance problems of your heart. But don't you dare think that the performance problems on the outside of your life will have any impact on the performance problems on your heart. And Jesus is going to go on and expand this more as we go on in the Sermon on the Mount in the next couple of weeks. He'll really take us to task on this. He'll say that, you can do X, Y, Z. You can be great at doing this and this and this and this. But what's the nature of your heart? Where are you at on your heart? That's really the issue in all of this stuff. And that's where the law really gains traction or doesn't gain traction in your life. And at the time in the first century when Jesus was there, he took the Pharisees to task because they were so focused on the outsides of their lives, of achieving those little things that they could achieve, that they never worried about their hearts. And as a result, they cheated themselves from a love for God. They cheated themselves out of a relationship with God. I think that's the greatest tragedy when you talk about what Jesus saw at the time. But here's these people whom God had given all this advantage to and told them about the law and what the law is all about. And the law was meant to bring them into relationship with God and to bring them into a love of the characteristics of God, to give them a love for the love of God. As they replicated it in their own lives, as they marveled at it as what God did with the nation of Israel, they were meant to fall more and more in love with God because of the law, which is why the psalmist so many times writes and says, "Oh God, your law, I love your law. It's like honey on my lips. It's like got more weight than gold itself. The law? Yeah, because the law is such a great representation of the nature of God's heart. And he wants us to enjoy and to fall in love with his heart. And as a result, in reciprocity, he will take that law, his characteristics, and he himself will write it on our hearts. That's the new covenant. That's the new covenant, is that God himself will do this in us. So when Jesus talks about performance problems, it's not because the outsides of us are failing to perform. It's not because we're failing to do the right things and helping other people. We often do that. And many religions major on those outward characteristics. Do good, do good, do good. I remember several people used to say to me, I'm trying really hard to be a good Christian. That phrase itself tells me that there's something tragically wrong, because you don't have to do a lot to be a good Christian. But you do need to draw near to God and fall in love with him. And the law and those things help you do that, but they're not an end in of themselves. They're like a tutor to help you in that relationship with God. That's the tragedy. If you get to the point where you're majoring on all those outward things, and in the process missing the major benefit which God had always intended, which is to bring you into relationship with him, then a great tragedy has happened. A great tragedy has happened. If you're sitting there wondering whether or not where you are on the whole spectrum of these things, would Jesus take you to task if you were in the first century because of how you're perceiving the law? Well, when we talk about the law, we talk about the problem of looking at things as lists. That's list thinking in terms of accomplishing a list for God. That's a wrong way to look at the law. You need to automatically look at the heart issues. Now, what's interesting and what's valuable about the outsides of your life, that is what you do, whether it's good or bad, is that it'll end up reflecting for you what the nature of your heart really is. It'll tell you what's inside that's invisible to you. And your actions will help you figure that out. And that's okay. But the issue isn't just to fix the actions and think everything is fixed. The issue is to look at the nature of your heart. And as we just read from the Old Testament and so many times in the New, the domain of your heart is a place where God has sway, if you'll let him have sway. So if you're asking yourself right now, well, do I have heart issues? We all do. If you have sin, you have heart issues. Can I work to fix those, list thinker that you are? You sort of can, but the best way to do is to go to God, who's a master of that realm, and say, God, I don't want this to be a part of who I am in my deepest nature. Remember that? We talked about at the beginning of the Beatitudes. Go to him and ask him to do something about this, to fix that. And in the end, not just because you want to be a changed person, but because you want to draw more near to God and to fall further in love with him. That's the point of all this. Because what we're doing is we're falling in love with who he is. And the law and the nature of our hearts, in contrast, helps us to understand what that's all about. That's God's job. So as Deuteronomy says, let me just read again. The Lord your God will circumcise your heart. That's what happens when you ask him to deal with that stuff. He'll circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring so that, here's the point, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. That's it. Deuteronomy 30, verse 6. It ought to be the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. It's awesome. But what a tragedy it is when you run into people who are involved in religion and they think religion is all about doing the right stuff. And it's all about not being scolded by the people who scold you about how to do religion properly. And that's not what it's all about. It's not what it's all about. Your actions will give you a clue to the nature of your heart. And the nature of your heart may leave you despondent about what you really are inside. But the good news is that's the domain that God wants to take control of and radically change and give you a growing appreciation for the nature of God's heart himself. But the tragedy is, all false religion does is it works on the outsides of your life and not on your insides. So it's like baseball in a sense. I talked about stats in baseball. Runs batted in, home runs, batting average. By the way, Frank Howard didn't have a great batting average, but not bad. You get to be in the top 5 of batting averages if you get to be around I don't know, around 300 hits per thousand, a 300 average. I think his was around 270. It's still pretty good. I mean, it's still pretty good. Not really performance problems. But the tragedy in relationship with God, as it is the tragedy in baseball, is there are people in baseball who major in the minutia of baseball, about the stats. And they can quote to you stats about the players and their performance here and their performance there and where they excel and where they don't excel, all that kind of stuff. They can quote to you all that kind of stuff. The tragedy is, have you ever met someone who majors in all that minutia? The dill, mint, and cumin minutia of baseball stats? But they don't love the game. But they don't love the game. When I played as a kid, I had performance problems, but I loved the game. I loved the game. When it comes to God, the law is our tutor to bring us into further relationship with Him. And that's its greatest value. Let it point you to Him. Let it bring you into relationship with Him. Ask Him to come and change the nature of your heart. And then in the very end of all of that, you come to love Him with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. And that was the point of the law. And if you ever come short of that, you have performance problems in the law. Well, like I say, in the next couple of weeks, Jesus will, He'll talk more about exactly what that looks like in specific areas of the law, what that performance problem looks like. In baseball, my performance problem was I'd swing and I wouldn't even hit the ball. I wouldn't even scratch the ball. It'd go right past me. Okay, you can't see the ball. We'll fix that. Jesus, in the next several teachings coming up right after this, will tell us how it is we're not contacting the ball when it comes to the law. Will show us where we're blind, where we can't see what's wrong. Our actions tell us something's wrong, but we can't quite figure out what it is. And over and over and over again, Jesus will point us to our hearts. And the core issue of the law is it has to be love-oriented. So I hope you're doing well. Hope you didn't mind me being out in the baseball field. I love being out here. But even to this day, the baseball field makes me shudder just a little bit because I remember some of my most embarrassing times as being a young boy and trying to play this game that I found so attractive and not being able to do anything at all. And then being in front of parents and friends and all those folks who love me so much and just not being able to perform. And so now I'm standing at the place I always wanted to stand my entire life, right here, first base. And this was a place I just could never get to in my life. But the great news about the kingdom of God is even though we have performance problems, God's at work to fix them, to fix your heart, and to bring you into relationship with Him. Thanks for being with us this morning, and God bless you.